We're glad you're here this morning. And I just want to say thank you for being here. And to the parents, thank you for being here and for bringing your kids. And so thankful that you're here. I heard it said recently, a noisy church is a good church. And if you hear the shuffling, and I know some of you have come to church today and it was just work to get here, and then it feels like you might as well be in a wrestling match during the service, and you should probably get one of those WWE championship belts afterward. You're making an eternal investment. And so thank you. I promise you, you may get home and you go, I didn't hear a word from the lesson. I didn't get anything out of the service. And that's okay. You can go back and watch it if you'd like to later. But I promise you, you're making an eternal investment. So thank you. So there's an author named Carol McLeod. She wrote a book called Have You Filled a Bucket Today? And while it's a children's book, it's a really fascinating idea. And she said, basically, we all have a bucket. And we carry around these invisible buckets. And what we do is we either get them filled or we have people draw out of the buckets. And so when your bucket gets filled, you're feeling really good. Life's going awesome. You're really thankful. And life's just really easy. You're encouraged. But when your bucket gets emptied, that's when you start to feel sad. You start to feel lonely. And she says in the book that the way that we fill our buckets or draw from buckets is through the words that we share. It's through actions. When we do kind things for one another, we're filling the buckets of other people. But when we say hurtful things or we do things out of selfishness, we begin to draw from one another's buckets. And as I've thought about that story in that book, it's really fascinating because one, I think it's true. While we don't carry a literal bucket, we do carry these invisible buckets. But the message behind the book is simply this: whatever you fill your bucket with, that's what you'll become. And that's a really challenging thought, not just for a children's book, for us as adults and kids in the room as well. Whatever you fill your bucket with, that's what you'll become. So if you fill your bucket with a lot of business deals, you'll become a business-minded person. If you fill your bucket with a lot of complaints, you'll become a person who's unthankful. If you fill your bucket with a lot of impatience, you'll become someone who's selfish. And as a result, what you'll do as your bucket is being filled with that is you'll actually be drawing from others' buckets as they're experiencing some of those negative sides. But what if we could fill our buckets with love? What if when people experienced us, all they experienced was love? And as they drew from our buckets, all they would get is love, because it's constantly being refilled by the love of God. I don't know if that's what Paul had in mind. I don't think he had a bucket in his mind when he wrote this in Colossians 3, verse 14. But he said, above all, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Above all, before you do anything else, and I don't know if you're like me, I'm a planner. I sit down usually sometime on Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, and I look at my schedule for the rest of the week, and I start thinking about what meetings am I going to have, what people do I need to reach out to, what tasks do I need to accomplish this week, not just this week, but what's coming up in the future, and I make me this to-do list, and I receive a lot of joy when I check one of those things off. I use a little app on my phone, and when I click it and it runs a line through it, I receive like this dopamine hit. I don't know, it's weird. It's just the way that my mind works. You can stop judging me right now, because I just feel a lot of joy when that list gets empty, which it never does. It's like I want to go out and celebrate. Well, if you're a to-do lister like I am, then what needs to be first on that list, or what needs to be at the top of your calendar every day, or what you need to write on your mirror before you do anything else, you need to put on love. Above everything else, above any meetings, above deciding what you're going to wear to school, before you do the project, before you walk out the door, you need to do this. You need to put on love. Now that phrase put on is really fascinating. It's actually added into our English translations, because what he literally says is Paul says, above all, agape love. And that's just kind of weird to think about. What does it mean to agape love? So we use this little phrase, put on, like you put on a shirt today. And that's the idea. Let that love cover your life so that when people see you, they experience this love, this beneficial, self-sacrificing love that looks out for the interests of others and not just for me. And this is the perfect bond of unity. It's complete. It's what will bring about maturity. It's a fascinating thought. Now, we hopped right into verse 14. But before Paul tells us what to do, he begins by telling us who we are. Now, we live in a culture, we've been raised in a culture, we've been discipled in a culture that is all about productivity, right? We're all about some activity. We are one of the busiest generations that has ever lived. And I don't know about you, when I look at my calendar, sometimes it's a little overwhelming. It gets really long. You're just going from sun up to sundown. And I've even found myself doing this, and I try not to, and I've been trying to break the habit, but when I'm talking to somebody and they say, well, how are things going? How are things going at church? How's your work going? I have been guilty of saying busy. They're going busy, as though that's like a pride or a badge that I should wear. Like, do you remember when you were maybe in elementary school and you participated in field day and you ran the events or whatever, and they handed out the little first, second, and third ribbons? It's almost like whoever can lay out the busiest schedule, you're going to get that number one ribbon. You're like number one, you're the most important. But that's not necessarily true, is it? In fact, sometimes busy is a burden. And what's fascinating about Paul in Colossians 3 is he does just like God did in Genesis 1. Before telling us what to do, he's going to start with identity. He's going to start by telling us who we are, because activity is meaningless if it's not tied to identity. And so when you open up to the very first page of your Bible, you might be familiar with Genesis chapter 1, that creation story. It's this beautiful account of how God created the world. But it's not a science textbook. It's actually an origin story. It's an identity story. Because if we were to get that for the very first time, the first question we would ask is not, how did all this come into being? The first question we would have asked is, how in the world did everything get to the way that it is? Why are things the way that they are? Have you ever asked that question? Well, you got to read the early chapters of the Bible, because it's going to explain why our world is as broken as it is, but it wasn't supposed to be that way. And so when you read Genesis chapter 1, you're reading an origin story. You're reading about a loving God who created this beautiful place that we call earth, and he created this place as a gift for his prized creation, those humans created on day 6. They were created to live in a loving relationship with God. And the beauty of Genesis 1 is that nobody was to live at the expense of another. There was no violence, there was no harm, there was no injustice, there was no murder. Even the animals were living in unity together. It's why we have those pictures in our children's Bibles of the lion laying right next to the lamb. And unfortunately, the story didn't stay like that for long, did it? In fact, it only takes you about 2 pages, and sin enters into the world in Genesis 3. And from then on, it changes the course of history. And God puts into motion this plan to redeem his creation so that one day things could be restored just like they were in Genesis 1, where we're living in perfect union with God. The God who created us in his image to live in relationship with him, where there are no boundaries, where we're not separated from him. One day things will be restored, where we will see him face to face, and we will live with him in perfect harmony and unity, just like that man and that woman did in the early chapters of Genesis. That's a day that we're looking forward to. What's fascinating is that as you read that story and you read through the book of Genesis, which if you're doing a yearly Bible reading plan, then you're right in the middle of Genesis this week, aren't you? And you're reading all of these stories, one right after the other, of the next human who's up, and are they going to be successful? Are they going to follow God? The answer, spoiler alert, no, they're all going to sin. They're all going to fail. It's just fail narrative after fail narrative. It's like, who's next? Oh, this one, they're going to fail too. And then you get to the end of Genesis, and all of a sudden, the nation, this family of Abraham is living in Egypt, and you open up to the next book, which is Exodus, and all of a sudden, the story has really turned, and now they're in bondage. Now they're being treated as slaves, and it goes from bad to even worse, and they're being mistreated as slaves, and they're being worked even harder, but they're growing and growing and growing, and they're crying out to God. And then he sends his deliverer named Moses, and he goes in and he frees Israel from Egyptian bondage. They cross the Red Sea. It's an exciting narrative. If you could see it in a movie, you'd have that climactic music just pounding in the background. It's getting your blood worked up. You're on the edge of your seat. And then they leave Egypt, and they're wandering through the wilderness, and they come to the edge of Mount Sinai. And that's when, for many of us reading our Bible, we go, ooh, that's where the story really slows down, and you get into a collection of laws. What's better to read than a collection of laws, right? And that's where we struggle, isn't it? What I find so fascinating about the early parts of the Bible is that it's not until Exodus chapter 20 that we finally find out what God really wants us to do. That's the first collection of laws. First time God really tells us explicitly what he wants his people to do. That's in Exodus chapter 20. Genesis has 50 chapters. Now I know it's Martin Luther King weekend. I know school's out. I know we got a federal holiday. I know we don't want to do math this morning, but we're going to. All right, what is 50 plus 20? What is it, church? 70. Very good, very good. See, I would have had to get out my calendar. That's why I asked you, because you don't ever trust a preacher when it comes to adding numbers. 70 chapters. It takes 70 chapters for God to tell you what he wants you to do. Well, then the question is, what are the prior 69 chapters? It's an identity story. It's God telling you who you are and whose you are before he tells you what to do. Paul takes the same mentality in the letter to the Colossians. It just doesn't take him 70 chapters. And some of us go, praise the Lord. He just shortened the Bible, right? It only takes him 3 chapters. Chapter 1 of Colossians, in this opening letter, he tells them who Jesus is. If you've never read the first chapter of Colossians, please spend some time there this week. It's some of the most beautiful language telling you who Jesus is. He's the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn over all creation. In him, all things hold together. It's poetic, the way that Paul writes this out. You can almost see him just grinning as he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he's just laying down line after line of beautiful imagery of who Jesus is. Then you get to chapter 2, and it begins to tell us who we are in Jesus. And he still hasn't gotten to what he wants us to do. He's just telling us who we are. So here's who Jesus is, chapter 1. Chapter 2, who we are in Jesus. Now, chapter 3, he's going to tell us what to do. So before he tells us to put on love, he's going to remind us of who we are. He's going to remind us of our identity. And he starts out with the word, therefore. And when you read the word, therefore, you've got to ask, what is therefore? Therefore, because therefore is there for a reason. And now you're really annoyed at me for saying therefore that many times. It's there for, sorry, I couldn't help it, one more time, to remind you of what he said in chapter 1. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In him and by him all things were made, and all things hold together. He's the head of the body, which is the church. Chapter 2, he reminds us that we've been buried with him in baptism. Chapter 3, he reminds us that we've been raised to walk in this newness of life. He reminds us that those who have set their minds on heavenly things are living for heavenly ways. And he reminds us that we're living for a higher lifestyle. And then as he gets into chapter 3, he's going to remind us of what we're trying to put to death, all of these earthly desires. That's what he's reminding us of before he gets to the word therefore. That's everything that's packed into this one short little word. It's everything he's already written. Therefore, as God's chosen ones. Chosen. I remember as a kid growing up you go play a game of pickup basketball or pickup football, and they decided to pick teams. That was always a nightmare. I'll just be honest with you. Because it's awful getting picked last. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever gotten picked last. It's embarrassing enough. Well, we got volunteers over here. That's okay. That's all on you. It's awful to do that, to experience that, right? You're like, well, I guess we'll take him, or I guess we'll take her. And you're like, thanks, I guess. Okay. You know what's worse than that? Not even getting picked at all. When they say, we'll play with one less, it'll be okay. We don't really need them. That's even more embarrassing, and you don't have to confess that this morning. It's rough when you're not picked. When Paul uses this word chosen, he's not talking about God playing eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Do you remember that? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by his toe. If he hollers, let him go. And I know we probably all have different variations. You just got to remember whatever you start with. I know I'm about to ruin this. Kids, close your ears. Whatever you start with, it's always going to be the other one if you only have 2 choices. And eeny, meeny, miny, mo will always be the other one. So I tell my kids, my wife is like, why do you ruin that for them? Now you've taken away our ability to help them make choices. Well, you just got to learn the math, okay? It's always the odd. Well, God didn't play eeny, meeny, miny, mo with people. He didn't say, hey, you made it. Hey, sorry, you didn't make the cut. This is a collective choosing. It's the language straight out of Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, God invites Israel to be his chosen people. He invites them in to live in a holy union with him, to be the people that he would show his goodness to all the world. And it's also language that's reminding us of a covenant. It's marriage language here. On April the 11th, 1999, it was a Sunday evening. I stood before a church family much like this one in Prattville, Alabama. And I confessed my sin. And I confessed my love and allegiance for King Jesus. And then I was lowered into some water. and raised to walk in newness of life. A moment I will never forget. On a Saturday afternoon, March the 4th, 2006, I stood in front of a room much like this one in Gulf Shores, Alabama. And I confessed my love and allegiance to Haley Elizabeth Bearden. And the two of us on that day were united together in a marriage ceremony. And what's fascinating, even though those two ceremonies looked very different, that Sunday night in 1999 and that Saturday afternoon in 2006 looked a whole lot alike. They had so many similarities. Yeah, one was baptism and the other was marriage, but really and truly, they're both a uniting together. When I gave my life to Jesus and confessed my allegiance to Him, my life was united with Him. That's the language Paul would use in Romans chapter 6. And on that Saturday afternoon, when I confessed my love and allegiance to Haley, it was bringing us together and uniting us together as one person. That's the language that Paul is using here in Colossians chapter 3. As God's chosen, you're invited in to live in a loving relationship. You're invited into this harmony, this unity, this marriage language that Paul is using. And that makes sense because the church is described as the bride of Christ. And I know that's a weird thing to think about, how you as a man can be the bride of Christ, but don't weird out on us this morning. It's just the way the Bible uses it, and you're just going to have to get good with it and get adjusted to it. You are the bride when it comes to being the church and being with Jesus. And it's not that you're going to change genders. It's just this love that Jesus has for His people because you are His chosen. And Paul says, you're holy and dearly loved. Because when you commit yourself to somebody, you're different, aren't you? You're distinct. You're no longer living like everybody else. You're not doing what you were doing before. Your life is radically different. Now, you're committed. You've changed your desire. You've changed your dreams and your goals. You've changed what you find pleasure in doing, because you're committed to someone. Well, as God's chosen, as His holy people, we're called to commit ourselves to Him, to be distinct, not so that we can be like, hey, look at us, we're so holy and set apart from you. But no, we're so committed to loving God, it's changed every aspect of who we are. It's changed our desires, it's changed our goals in life. What was once important, it's not that important anymore. It's like Andy talked about in our adult Bible class. We can get so worked up about things that happen to us in this life, but when you put them in an eternal perspective, they're really not that important anymore. It's not as hard to grant forgiveness to somebody when you view it in an eternal scheme. But if you've only got a few years left and this is all you got, then you better hold on to those grudges, because what's going to happen when your life comes to an end? Eternity changes everything. Our commitment to Christ changes everything. You're holy, but you're also dearly loved. This is a phrase that has with it the idea underneath it of longing for someone, longing to be with someone. This past March, to celebrate our anniversary in this last year, Haley and I went to Disney World. We've been to Disney World on multiple occasions, but we've never been without kids. And let me just say, folks, that is awesome. It is awesome to go and to leave your kids behind, tears and all, mad that they weren't getting to go, and just go spend that time together. It was amazing. We did so much stuff that we had never done before because we didn't have kids in tow. So I'm just encouraging you, if you can make it work, it's worth a shot. Now, the entire time we were there, we were constantly talking about the children. Be like, oh man, they would really love this. Oh, I bet they're so mad right now sitting at the house. Oh man, this would be awesome. Why don't we get them this to take them a little token home? I wonder what they're doing. I hope they're having a good day. Oh, I can't wait to be home and to see them and to spend time with them. Because you've experienced it. When you're somewhere but your heart is somewhere else, after a little while you're kind of ready to get back to where your heart is, right? Think about God. Yeah, He's in heaven. And He's enjoying all of glory. But His heart is with you. He can't wait. He longs to be with you. He longs for you to be in His presence. And He's working toward that day when you'll stand before Him and see Him face to face. And I can only imagine what that's going to be like. But in the meantime, I think it's so important, what Paul is trying to get us to internalize is that you're God's chosen. You're holy and dearly loved. I don't know what your week is going to hold. I don't know what last week looked like for you. Maybe one of the best weeks you've had, maybe one of the worst weeks that you've ever had. I don't know what this week's going to be like. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. You know, life can change in a moment, in a phone call, in an instant. But you know what's important? Every day we wake up and we remember and we internalize, I'm God's chosen. I'm holy and dearly loved. And what it will do is grant you a different perspective, and it will allow you to do what Paul is going to say next. Because now Paul's going to tell you what to do. But what to do doesn't really matter if you don't know who you are. That's why he begins with identity. So here's what he wants you to do. Put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another if anybody has a grievance against another. Just as I forgave you, you also forgive. And above all, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. So here's our big idea. As we kicked off last week, this theme, one of the core values of our church is to live love, to be people who are filled with God's love and who are living it out every day, so that as people experience us, they're experiencing love. Here's what I want us to think about this morning. Love is not just something we feel. Love is who we are to become. It's this action and identity. Now, some of us have maybe been guilty of kind of buying into the Hallmark version of love, and I promise if you love the Hallmark Channel, I'm not trying to offend you right here. It's just every Hallmark movie is the same. Every romantic comedy is the same. There's this perfect person for them. They can't see them. They're going along throughout life, and then all of a sudden they wake up and they're like, I'm in love. And our culture tries to present love as this giant unavoidable pit that you fall into. You're just going through life, and the next thing you know, wham, I fell in a hole, and my goodness gracious, I just happen to be in love. And we have robbed love of what it actually is. It's a verb. It's a choice. Yet it is an emotion you experience, but it's not something you fall into. It's something you behave yourself into. Because when you started to experience those emotions, you changed your behavior. You cleaned yourself up a little bit, didn't you? You started acting a little differently. You changed some of your manners and some of your behaviors, and you guarded your words when you're in the presence of that person that you were trying to impress. And your heart was drawn toward them, and you told yourself, I'm in love, but really what you're doing is you are behaving in love, because love is a verb, and that's what the Bible is trying to convince us of. And so love is not something you fall into and fall out of. It's something you behave into and behave out of, because love is a verb. It is absolutely a choice. It is not only an action of something we're called to do, but it is an identity, someone that we are to become, so that as people experience us, they are experiencing the love of Christ. It becomes this identity. It becomes our bucket, that everywhere we go, we carry around this bucket. It's just filled with love, because we talked about last week, God is love, and we live from His love, and we live in His love, and therefore we live through His love. So as people experience our love, they're really just experiencing God's love. And as we internalize that, and that becomes who we are, our buckets will forever be filled with the love of God, so that others can experience it. So two quick takeaways so that this makes sense. The first one is that love is heard in actions. Now, I was blessed to grow up in a family, and I don't know what your family was like growing up. I was blessed to grow up in a family that regularly told one another, I love you. And I'm blessed to have a family where we regularly share those words with one another on multiple times a day, to utter those words, I love you. And I think it's so important, not just with our family, with one another, with our brothers and sisters in Christ, to say, I love you. And I'm so thankful you're part of the family of God. But words can be cheap, right? Actions, you've heard the phrase, speak louder than words. And we live in a culture that really doesn't even value words anymore, because people lie so frequently. So rather than just telling one another we love one another, what if our love was loud and people heard our love through the way that we acted? That's what John was getting at in 1 John chapter 3. He says, little children, and I love that. He's an older man at this point. He's writing to his children in the faith, and I just love that little phrase, my little children. Little children, let us not love in word or in speech, but in action and in truth, because love is best seen. It's best heard in actions. And so I wanted you to think about this week. What are some ways that you can shout your love for your family through your actions? What are some ways you can shout your love for your coworkers through your actions? What are some ways you can shout your love for your neighbors through your actions? Through your friends, through those that you're trying to share the goodness of God with. Maybe this week there's an opportunity for you to pay for somebody's coffee or pay for their meal or help somebody who's in need. Maybe this week there's an opportunity for you to fix something or to deliver just a kind word, a kind text, a phone call for somebody who you know has been kind of down or has had a lot going on or life's dealt them a difficult set of cards to play with. Maybe it's just you decide to do something that you know you need to do, but you don't need to be prompted this time. Maybe you are going to take out the garbage without having to be asked. Or you're going to do that little kind act. You're going to figure out how does that person receive love, and that's what you're going to do. And not just for those you live with and those you love and those that are easy to love, but maybe it's even the person that's recently offended you. Maybe it's the person who's recently chewed you out. You had the difficult conversation and it's kind of awkward right now. That's probably the best place you could shout your love, where it will mean so much more. Because love is heard in actions. And if we're going to be people who live love, then we've got to shout it with our life and with what we do. And here's the second takeaway. Love is like glue. It holds everything together. And you know this. Have you ever glued two things together? When you try to pull them apart, yes, you can get them apart, but not without it damaging both parties. Because love is like glue. And so this love holds all of our relationships together. That's why we're thinking about this year, thinking about what it means to live love, because it's all about relationships. The great command is to love God. And the second greatest is to love neighbor. It's all about relationships. So when you walk into this room this morning, if you walked in and you felt pretty comfortable, you weren't necessarily stressed and anxious about who you're going to talk to, where you're going to sit, what was it going to be like, I just want to challenge you. I believe that you and I that feel that way have a responsibility to help connect with the person who walks into this place and experiences some anxiety for whatever reason. It's our responsibility for those who don't experience that to help those who do to feel welcome, to feel at home, because it's all about relationships. If you get a copy of our bulletin, which I hope you will, and I hope you'll spend some time looking through, there's a lot of prayer requests, there's a lot of activities that are going on. Every activity you're going to read, and you might even look through and go, goodness gracious, this is a busy church. And we are a very busy church. And we don't wear that as a badge to go, hey, look at us. It's all a means to an end. Every activity on there is an opportunity for you to engage in loving relationships with God's people, for you to grow in covenantal community. They're all a means to an end. Whether it's like a family game night, or whether it's like a prayer breakfast, or a senior luncheon, or it's a baby shower, a wedding shower, or it's some type of service-based event, everything that's on that calendar is an opportunity. It's a means to an end for us to come together and to grow in our love for one another and to grow in our love for King Jesus, because it's all about relationships. It's time for me to share with you our weekly Bob Goff quote. I joked last week that I'll probably share with you one a week, and I'm 2 for 2, folks, so just get ready. Bob Goff said, "As for me, I've realized that I used to be afraid of failing at things that really matter to me, but now I'm actually more afraid of succeeding at things that don't really matter." I've tried to, and am trying to internalize this truth because he's so right. I don't want to get to the end of my life and go, wow, I was really successful in a bunch of stuff that really doesn't matter. What really matters? It's our relationships. You get to the end of your life, it's really irrelevant how much money is in your bank account. It's really irrelevant how many awards are on your wall. It's really irrelevant as to how much success, earthly success you've experienced. That's just stuff to be left for somebody else or to be thrown in the garbage. What will matter is who's by your side. That's what really matters. That community, those relationships, and how much you've invested. And let me just tie it all back together. Every person you experience has a bucket. Are you filling? Or are you drawing from their bucket? Are you pouring into them? Or are you dumping them out? It's all about relationships. Our relationship with God. Our relationship with one another. So, as God's chosen ones, holy and dearly loved, Brethren, let's put on love, which binds everything together in perfect unity. If you're here this morning and you've not fully experienced the love of God because you've not completely surrendered your life to Him, we now have this time that we call the opportunity. It's an invitation where God is inviting you to lay down whatever it is that's holding you back and just completely surrender your life to Him. You don't have to clean up your life before you come to Him because, one, you're not any good at that. You've tried and you've failed. And number two, God's going to do that for you anyways. And He's much better at cleaning up people's lives than you and I will ever be. He just invites us to surrender. Whatever we have, whoever we are, lay it before Him and allow Him to wash those sins away, and to sanctify you and begin this process of making you new, filling your life with His love so that as people encounter you, all they receive is love after love after love. That's the invitation of Jesus. And if you're ready to confess your allegiance to Him and be baptized into Christ today, man, we love to celebrate that with you. This morning, if you're here and you just realize, you know what? I've filled my life and my bucket with stuff that really doesn't matter. I've become somebody that I don't want to be anymore. Maybe it's negativity. Maybe it's complaining. Maybe it's selfish. Maybe it's chasing after the wrong things. And you realize, I want to become a person that's filled by the love of God. And I need to rededicate my heart. And I need to surrender my life again to Christ. Our shepherds are going to be in front and in the back. And if you would like for them to pray over you, they'd love to do that. Whatever you need this morning, please let us know as we stand and sing.